All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Dear Editor, which is our ongoing conversation series about writing and publishing scientific articles. My name is Erica Goodoff, and I'm a senior scientific editor in the Research Medical Library. And I'm joined this morning by Amy Nanetto, who is also senior scientific editor in the library. Larissa is here as well, can help you answer any other questions that Amy and I can't cover. And we're going to be talking to you this morning about how to make good figures and tables to go with your article. You may have noticed we're in meeting format today instead of our usual webinar format. And that's because we wanted to use one of the features that is not available in webinar format. And in fact, I'm going to go to that right now. Just like with any other session in this series, we are monitoring the chat box. So if you have questions as we're going along and you don't want to be talking over the other, at this point, 65 people, feel free to type your question into the chat box and we'll be paying attention to that as well. But first, I want to do this. I'd like to hear from you. In your opinion, what is the most challenging thing about designing figures and tables? And you don't have to use the chat box for this. If you go to the top of your Zoom screen and click on View Options and then click on Annotate, you can actually write directly on your screen using the text feature, or I think you can also use the draw feature. The text feature is a little bit easier though. But you can put it right in front of the screen in front of you, and we'd like to hear from you. What do you find difficult about making figures and tables? Yes, design is hard. Exactly. Amount of time it takes. All right. So motivating to use something more creative than Excel. Okay. Yeah, I hear that. How would the audience make sense of it? Not including too much, not having a designer, not designing is hard, all of these things, yes. Being clear with a lot of information in a small space, certainly. Yes, all of these things sound very familiar. And these are all things that we hear a lot from authors who are trying to do figures and struggling with them. So yeah, you're definitely not alone. I think most people are kind of looking at this and going, yeah, this all sounds really familiar. Okay, yes, making it eye-catching without being overwhelming, all of these things. That's great. These are all things that, many of these are things that we're going to cover this morning. And certainly what we don't cover, we can point you to additional things. So, moving along from this, I'm going to have to clear those. Okay, clear all. Okay, so if Amy or Larissa would launch the poll, the first poll, I would like to know, what part of a research article do you look at first? Okay. We have a very clear winner coming in here, but lots of people are answering. So I'll give it a couple more seconds for people to answer this question. Okay. So I think we have a lot of responses, so I'll end the poll there. So there were 4 choices here. There were abstract, there were figures and tables, reference list, and discussion. Nobody said reference list or discussion. The clear winner here was definitely the abstract. Most people say they look at the abstract first, and that makes a lot of sense. The abstract is, of course, a short summary of the rest of the paper. But coming in second place was also figures and tables. And that was exactly why we had this poll, because even if you don't do it, many of your colleagues are saying, oh, I look at the abstract and then maybe the second thing I look at, or it could even be the first thing they look at is the figures and tables in the paper. So if people are looking at your figures and tables, certainly before they're reading the whole text of your paper, What does that mean when it comes to designing your figures and tables? I think the first thing to think about is the legends that go with your figures and tables. Before we get into some of the, deeper design things, keep in mind that if people are looking at your figures and tables first, or maybe second, you want your figures and tables to be understandable without having to look at the whole text of the paper to understand them. So you want to provide enough detail within your figure legend so that it's understandable without, reference to the main text. And these are some general guidelines you can think about when writing figure legends to help with that. The first is you might think about beginning with a brief title of the figure, just a couple of words to just describe what it is. And that doesn't mean you have to identify the type of figure. Like, for instance, you don't need to say Kaplan-Meier curves showing estimates of. You can just say Kaplan-Meier estimates of, and the fact that it's a curve or a graph or something is fairly self-evident to someone looking at the paper. The other thing to think about with keeping your figure legends, to stand by themselves, is you want to expand any abbreviations that appear in the legend, but also within the figure itself. If you have a bunch of, little 3-letter abbreviated things in your figure, your legend should explain what those are. A figure legend might also contain some statistical or methodologic information, depending on the journal that you're submitting it to. And with any of these things, obviously, you want to follow your journal instructions. That does mean if your journal instructions say, keep your entire figure legend under 10 words, you probably aren't going to have a lot of space to include any statistics or a lot of, information. But most of the time, at least in my experience, journals don't offer a ton of direction on what to do with figure legends. And if they don't, this is a good general rule of thumb to follow. Just again, keeping in mind that people tend to look at your figures and tables pretty early on when they look at when they look at your article, if not first. So those are some things to keep in mind when describing the figures. But that, of course, leads to, all right, I have a great description, but what do I actually put within the figure itself? And so for that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy. Oops.
Unmute. Hi, everyone. So I wanted to talk about some insights about good graphing practices from kind of the guru of data visualization in recent years. Almost every article or website that you look at on scientific data presentation is going to make reference to a book by Edward Tufte called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. Here it is. I don't know if you can see it because I have a green screen. There's a lot there, some of which is about kind of infographics in journalism, but a good bit of the book is dedicated to presenting technical and scientific data. So two of the principles I wanted to draw, well, let me back up a second. I put this quote from Tufte because I think it really speaks to your overarching goal. And I think someone actually mentioned this in the little on the whiteboard. He says data graphics should draw the viewer's attention to the sense and substance of the data, not to something else. So you want to draw attention to the data, not to the figure. And I think somebody said something like, you want to make it, you want to make it detailed and present the data without it being overwhelming. And so I think it's a good idea to think about your figures as telling a story. They're not just a container for data, but in fact, a kind of story, and you're trying to convince your readers or make an argument for something. So two principles that he talks about are the ideas of data ink and chartjunk. So by data ink, he means, and think of ink as not just ink, but like virtual ink. The ratio of the ink used to convey data to the total ink used to print the graphic. So ideally in Tufte's world, all of the ink on a figure would convey data or information somehow, and none would be extraneous. So the ideal data ink ratio is 1:1. Now you're probably not going to achieve that, but you should strive to reach reach a point where there's not a lot of stuff on the figure that is not conveying information. And related to that is the idea of chart junk, which we see a lot of in graphs. And by that, he means the excessive graphical paraphernalia that's either conventional, like we're just kind of used to seeing figures that way, or it's sometimes automatically inserted by graphing software. And all of these things add visual clutter, but they don't necessarily convey any information. And this example from Tufte's book is kind of a funny one with all this Baroque illustration on a very simple graph about fuel economy standards. But it, chart junk can also include things like grid lines, frames, three-dimensional effects, excessive labeling, excessive and kind of harsh use of color. So again, your goal should be to maximize the data ink ratio and erase as much chart junk as you can. So let's look at an example. Okay, so this is an example of two graphs that approach this question of data ink and chart junk kind of differently. On the left, you see a graph from, I think from 2020, from the TMC's COVID-19 dashboard, and it shows hospitalizations and the 7-day daily hospitalization trend. And on the right, you see a reworking of those same data by another data visualization expert, Kaiser Fung, who runs the blog cited at the bottom of the page, Junk Charts. So if you look at what has been erased from the TMC's chart, you see that there's an excess of data ink, and that excess of data ink sort of obscures the message of the graph. So let's look at some of the things that, let me see if I can grab the pointer. Okay, let's see if that works. Can you see my little arrow? Yeah. So here you see that there's a list of every single date on the x-axis, and they're written vertically, and they're a little hard to see because they're all kind of jammed together and they're all in the same format. And you see what they've done over here is they just mark every 5th day. Oops, there's my pointer. Erica, is that you with the pointer? It's not me. So they just mark every 5th day and the month here. So that's a lot easier to understand. Another thing that they've done, you see that there's some extraneous information on these bars. So the height of the bar should show you about how, what the number, actually in the y-axis here isn't even labeled, but presumably that's the number of hospitalizations. So the height of the bar tells you the number of hospitalizations. There's not really any need to have it also indicated on the bar, and that also adds a bunch of visual clutter. It makes it, and then again, the numbers are vertical and they're pretty hard to read. Another thing you might not have even noticed on this graph are these 2 diamonds. And these diamonds actually indicate the phase 1 reopening in 2020 in May, and then the phase 2 reopening. And you can see that I think what the chart is trying to show is that its story is that the reopening increased cases or increased hospitalizations. But you can see that that's really hard to make out in the clutter of all these data. And that this graph, which replaces the bars with these little dots, because of course the moving average is what's important here, not necessarily hospitalizations on any one day. And then the use of shading for the phase 1 and phase 2 reopening tells you the story of the trend, what happened after the reopening, much more clearly than this sort of overly data heavy and sort of ink heavy graph. So Another thing that you want to do is take advantage of the conventional reading order of English, that is from left to right and top down, to draw readers' attention to the key comparisons you want to make. This is another way to make your reader's eye move quickly and easily, kind of naturally, across your figures and here a table. So you can see in this table, there's two ways to organize it. One puts the radiation dose at the top, and then you read across. So what's being compared there, the key comparison in the left to right reading order, would be the radiation doses. Whereas what's being compared in the bottom table is response. Now, typically, the dependent variable is displayed across the columns and the independent variables in the rows. So the top graph is something that you would probably see more often. But if there's a reason to do so, if it makes sense to do so, you could also do it the bottom way. So it helps to think about, again, the story you're trying to tell, the comparisons you want readers to be able to highlight and pick up on very quickly. So I'm going to launch another poll and ask you to tell me what you think is wrong with this graph. You can move the poll window to see the graph. Just a couple more seconds. I think we're converging on some answers here. So you see that the top answer was B and C. So yeah, the font is kind of hard to read, especially the axis labels. And the resolution is really low. That might be kind of hard to make out on Zoom. So let's look at how we could make this better. So before I go on to that, a couple of things here. The use of this font here and here with serifs, that is fonts like Times New Roman that have the little feet on the letters, serifs, are difficult to read at the small size that figures are usually printed at. So it's best to use a sans serif font like Arial or Helvetica, as here on the numbers. They're just a lot clearer and easier to read when they're small. Another thing is that the resolution on this is terrible. This can often happen when you're importing files and images around from one file format to another. Like, you might do a poster in PowerPoint and you might like shrink the images down, then you might copy them into your manuscript and you lose resolution sometimes when you do that. So it's really important to follow the journal instructions for the format. Most journals ask for TIFF instead of JPEG formats for figures, but you should check the instructions. And they usually specify for graphs like this at least 300 DPI, sometimes 6, and for photographs even higher. So again, journals almost always tell you information in the instructions about figure resolution. It is okay to include the p-value here. If you have a lot of comparisons with a lot of p-values, it's probably better to indicate those with asterisks 1, 2, or 3 and to find those p-values in the legends. But if you only have like this one comparison, it's perfectly fine to do that. I don't think it needs to be in red, but you can. So here's a better version, obviously a lot clearer. The fonts are consistent, consistently sans serif. They're also a little bit larger, so they're large enough to read when the image is reduced down to what fits on a page. And again, they use the asterisk here. That reduces some visual clutter, but again, you need to be sure to define that in the legend. Especially when you're writing grants, because you're trying to conserve space, people often make their figures very small. So you really need to pay attention to resolution there. Okay.
Yeah, certainly if they get small enough that they're not even legible,
Yeah,
you're going to irritate your reviewers.
Well, and I have seen NIH grants come back that were probably fundable on the first round and be sent back to with we can't evaluate your preliminary data adequately because we can't read the figures. So it really is important to pay attention to resolution and clarity.
Yeah, and if you're going to shrink it down, you know, something like this example, you want to make sure that text, like on the labels, is big enough that you can read it once you've shrunk down. You know, the bars are still going to be legible even if they're little, but you need to be able to see that that's tumor weight on the one side and, you know, which one's control and so forth.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. So another thing we wanted to mention just kind of briefly, it's worth thinking about accessibility concerns when you're designing figures. So about 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women have some type of color blindness. Color blindness doesn't mean that, you know, you probably know this, it doesn't mean you're like seeing the world black and white. It means you see colors just slightly differently. But I want to mention that statistic because it's more than you think it is. You know, 1 in 12 men means, let's see, there's 75 people on this call. Statistically, somebody on this call probably has this condition, or if not, knows somebody who has it. Certainly I do. There's people in my family who have this. But there's, in any case, it's not a hugely debilitating condition, but for something like figures in a scientific article, it can really change people's ability to understand what you're trying to say, the story that you're trying to tell with your figure. And in fact, a number of journals have started including instructions recommending against using these red-green contrasts to prevent readers from, you know, not being able to understand your figures. So the images that you see here are sort of meant to illustrate what that looks like. So the things here on the right, like these, like this is you know, a heat map, and it shows in red and green using the contrast. And this down here, of course, this is immunofluorescence type images. What you see here on the right are those same images that have been run through a filter to show what it would look like to somebody who can't perceive a difference between red and green shades. So you can kind of see it all looks yellow, basically. And down here, same sort of thing. You can't see the contrast between the two colors that's supposed to be in the original image. So how do you prevent this from happening? You can do this. If so, for example, going back to this heat map here, they've used Photoshop or something to change the red into magenta, and now if you run that version through the color blindness filter, you get this instead. So the colors are still going to look different to somebody who has this, you know, deuteranopia, I can never say that. If you have that condition, you know, the colors look different, but you can still see the contrast between them. And same down here. If we've replaced the red with magenta, you know, you get this or you get this, or you can replace the green with turquoise and you get this. So different colors, but you can see the contrast, and the contrast is what's really important in these images. So obviously, you know, it's okay or even necessary to use, you know, Photoshop to do these, to recode these colors. And I think for microscopy images like these, you can also use ImageJ to recode these colors. There's settings within the software that will allow you to do that. The only thing I want to caution you about is if you do change a color for an accessibility reason like this, you want to make sure you change every single pixel in that color. And I believe that's the default in most of this type of software. You don't, if you say change the red to magenta, it'll change every pixel. But you definitely want to make sure you do that, because obviously if you didn't, then you would be changing the information within the figure, and that's clearly not going to be your intent here. That would not be a good thing to do. But you know, you can see just shifting one color makes this easier to read for, you know, for more people who are going to be looking at your article. And as always, you know, you want to say in the legend, oh, okay, you know, red represents this, the green represents this. I can tell you again from knowing enough people who have this condition, yes, they may see blue and orange when you say red and green. They'll be able to tell what you mean just from a lifetime of understanding that they see colors differently. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but you definitely want to make clear one color's this, one color's this, and the contrast is really the key thing that you want to get across in these images. All right, so one other comment about accessibility. You may be aware of something called alt text. So alt text can help readers with visual impairments who rely on screen readers to understand images. And it's primarily used in things like web pages and social media. Because typically in an Adobe PDF file, a screen reader would automatically read any legend that was attached to an image. And that's very often the case on an article that you've published online. Most of the time people are pulling up PDF. And obviously, if they're looking at it in HTML or something, you don't have control over that. But most of the time, the default in that type of program is for the alt text, is for the screen reader is going to read the legend that accompanies the figure. So again, another reason to put some thought into your figure legends as well. But if you are someone who wants to promote your article on Twitter and you want to post an image, then it's worth thinking about alt text, because anybody with the screen reader isn't even going to be able to see the image at all. So here's just an example of what that looks like. It looks, in fact, if you read this text, it's really similar to a figure legend. So that's something that you can think about if you want to post, if you want to tweet your, a figure or something from your article, or graphical abstract or something. But yeah, something worth thinking about, certainly if you're going to be posting things on websites and that kind of thing. That was really all I wanted to say about that, unless you had another comment on that. But there was one other thing we wanted to talk about when it comes to making any edits to figures. I'll throw this one back over to Amy for a second too.
Yeah, so like Erica said, it's permissible and even desirable to adjust figures within certain limits to increase accessibility and readability, but you need to be careful not to over adjust in a way that actually alters what you're trying to say. So all image-based figures like blots and gels and microscopy images should preserve the original data's integrity, and should be transparent about any changes that you make. And a lot of journals now, because of kind of rampant problems with Western blots, are requiring you to submit, not for publication, but just for review, the full image of the blot, not just certain lanes or bands. So, for example, in this, you can see the original blot here has these three sections, and you can see that what the authors have done is they really only want to draw attention to the one on the left and the one on the right. So they want to splice out this middle set of lanes. And the incorrect way to do that will be to splice it in a way that suggests that those lanes weren't there. You want to use some kind of marker. You can see there's a black line here. You can use space. Sometimes journals have preferences, sometimes they don't. But you want to be transparent about the fact that you cropped there. And you also see that they include the bands above and below and the molecular weight markers there. And similarly, if you're making composite images, you want to be careful not to inadvertently suggest that they are from the same field. So here you have two separate fields. It is not right to just stick them together and make it look like this was all one field. The red box here, and you want to state that in the legend as well, will indicate that this inset is from a different image. So any alterations you make, you just want to make them clearly visible to reviewers and readers so that they know what they're looking at, and you're not inadvertently deceiving people. And finally, I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the resources that are available to you at MD Anderson. You may have used these already. Both GraphPad Prism, which I think from my limited use of it is a really good graphing program in the sense that it does not insert a lot of chart junk. It its default settings are pretty good in terms of not putting weird patterns on things or using strange fonts and things like that. The Adobe Creative Suite of software is also available in MD Anderson's Software Center for you to download. That includes Illustrator, which can be useful when you're making figures, and Photoshop, which can be used for the kinds of things Erica was talking about just adjusting color and things like that. Again, make sure that you apply any color changes or things like that to the entire image, not just to sections. And then something people just love is BioRender. And we can, you can get a free BioRender account by going to biorender.com and signing up using your MD Anderson email address. And BioRender is really fun for and really quick way to make all kinds of figures, but primarily like illustrations of molecular pathways or cells or those kinds of things. So those are available to you. So if you have any questions, we are happy to answer them. You can either just, I guess, yell them out or type them in the chat.
Yes. And
There's
as
the
always,
link to BioRender.
yes. And as always, we're going to post copies of these slides. And also we have a list of a much more comprehensive list of resources to point you to as well. Some of the sources that we used, the color blindness filter thing that I showed you, there's a couple of links to that as well. And we also have more detailed presentations about making figures and tables that go into a little bit more detail than we could do in half an hour this morning. So we'll have those, we'll post them on the Teams for you later as well. Right. Yes, and Alyssa will also share them through email for people who attended today as well.
Yeah.
So when you guys were doing the whiteboard part, someone said that they never understand the image file types in the resolution. And we do get those questions sometimes about file types and resolution. Do you think they can just contact strategic communications too with those kinds of questions, right?
Yeah, I think they should be able to answer those kinds of things. Yeah. So strategic communications, let me see if I can pull up the link. Strategic communications can also do medical illustrations. So if you find that you have some sort of, maybe a complicated anatomical or surgical image or something like that, that you can't do with BioRender, they do have medical illustrators on staff who can help you. They can do, they're very skilled and could do the drawings for you. And here they are. Let me just copy the link into the chat for strategic communications. And they can also answer questions about file sizes. They can help you with posters, things like that. I should point out that BioRender now has a poster tool. And MD Anderson has a lot of resources on the Brand Central site, templates and things like that for making sure that you get the proper MD Anderson logo and things and format and things like that on your posters.